Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session of Conversations in Conflict Studies. I'd like to start us off by respectfully acknowledging the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. My name is Logan Carnacelli. I'm a graduate assistant here at the Program for the Advancement of Research on Conflict and Collaboration, also known as PARC, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this presentation series. Today's talk, titled Identity and Nonviolent Action, How Who We Are Matters in Resistance, is with Anya Stanger, who began her research on some of America's most committed nonviolent activists right here in central New York. In this talk, she will discuss the strategy of prison witnesses going to jail for 6 months or more as a result of nonviolent resistance as a window into understanding not just contemporary nonviolent action, but also how such action is shaped by identity. Indeed, who we are matters not only in what activists can and cannot do to create change, but is also crucial in impacting their own experiences of resistance and incarceration. Anya Stanger, PhD of Social Science here from Syracuse University, is the author of Incarcerated Resistance: How Identity, Gender, and Privilege Shape the Experiences of America's Nonviolent Activists. She teaches conflict studies at Syracuse University and women's and gender studies at Sierra College. Anya, thank you for being here today.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, I have been warned that the acoustics here are not awesome. So don't be shy. I usually have a pretty loud voice, but don't be shy if you can't hear me. So thank you so much for having me. It's really wonderful to be back. My desk was in Park the whole time I was here as a graduate student, so it feels very full circle to be coming back and doing a conversation. So when I was thinking about speaking, when I was thinking about speaking about this topic here, I felt like I needed to sort of backstory my own story a little bit. Because we're in a really special place. So when I moved here as a graduate student, I knew nothing about Central New York. I knew nothing about Syracuse. I just knew that I wanted to do the social science program, and I chose that one because I wanted to bring together my sort of twin loves of feminism and nonviolence. And so I knew I had the right program. This was the right place to support that, but I didn't realize I was in the right place, the right sort of geographical space. So Central New York has this amazing history. Most people know about the women's movement in Seneca Falls. There's also this incredible history around abolition and fights for racial justice. And this is also a place where the indigenous people have always been extremely organized. And then these sort of things go together. I think the thing that struck me, I know the thing that struck me so much moving here was I'm from California, I'd lived in Berkeley, these sort of like liberal bastions of the world. This is a place where activism has been intersectional for centuries. And that really is different than anywhere else I've ever lived, anywhere else I feel like I've been aware of. And so this is a place where Matilda Jocelyn Gage did her work in the 1800s, where she brought these three struggles together and said, we have to fight for all three at once. We can't do just one. This is the place where, the Jerry rescue happened, where congregations from 7 white churches came together when Jerry was thrown in jail in Syracuse and said, no, not in my name. We will not have a person who's been enslaved in our jail, in our town. No, right? Not in my name. So we have this sort of history of many forms of activism, but including more privileged people acting in concert with, on behalf of, as part of movements that have long been recognized as intersectional, which doesn't mean every single person all the time, but that strain is something that has been here. So this is a place, it's a geographic place that could support my research in ways I had absolutely no idea how important that would be, right, when I started doing research here. And I didn't know I was going to do research on nonviolent activists. That also sort of, I didn't know what I was going to do. You don't know what you're going to do before you start. But it just so happened that I had this wonderful sort of confluence of my idea of what I was going to research, and not only the university, but Central New York, the region, that could support that in this really unique way. And so I think just sort of remembering that, starting our day, placing ourselves in this context is important, because it's the trajectory that we're still working in, right? So my own research. Oh, I have a PowerPoint for you guys. Let's see. Uh-oh. The arrow?
Yeah, in the bottom left of the screen.
Oh. Do I?
If you move it around, it should pop.
Oh, this is, I should have practiced. I can't see an arrow. Do I see it? I just, here, will you do it for me?
Yeah, absolutely. You just cue me.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Logan. Oh, yeah, that's, okay. So my research, this book is about nonviolent activists in the United States who go to jail for 6 months or more for nonviolent resistance. So this is not a common or an easy thing to do. It's a very small group of people. 6 months is a really long time to go to jail for nonviolence. You can resist something with violence and go to jail for 6 months. You can resist something with nonviolence and go to jail for a night or a week. But to do 6 months means you are doing something very intentionally, very strategically, and probably in a very particular location where you know that authorities will react in a certain kind of way. So most of the people who do this belong to one of two movements. I wasn't looking to study peace activists, but the people who do this particular strategy are generally disarmament and peace activists. This has changed a little bit because I did this research in 2010, 11, 12, right? And movements are different now. This is before, this research predates sort of a national Black Lives Matter movement, the Keystone Pipeline, right? Some really crucial movements that have happened in the last decade that this is all just before. But even still, not a lot of these folks are going to jail for 6 months, right? It's still a very sort of selective strategy. Belong to one of two movements, the School of the Americas Watch movement and Plowshares. Plowshares is an anti-nuclear movement started in the 1980s by two brothers from Syracuse, New York, because I tell you, this is the spot, Dan and Phil Berrigan, who were Catholic priests, and they started a technique, a nonviolent technique of going onto military bases and hammering on nuclear nose cones, pouring their own blood, doing sort of symbolic protests and actual damage to military parts in order to have a sort of biblical witness against the weapons and towards sort of the world that their conscience and their belief system was working towards. And so it tends to be more dramatic forms of action. Actually, you can flip it forward. One more, because I've got some pictures. Here's a Plowshares. This is the Transform Now action that happened in Oak Ridge, Tennessee in 2014. You can see where they cut fence here. They cut the fence. They did some spray painting. They spray painted on the side of this. And this is like, you have to go, it was described as the inner sanctum of U.S. nuclear storage capacities in the United States is at this spot. And the three people who did this action were, one was in his 60s, one was in his 70s, and the other was an 82-year-old nun. So they're very symbolic actions, and they're quite dramatic. People tend to have sort of big responses to these actions. The School of the Americas Watch, you can flip through again. This is sort of an example of what illegal trespass in a different sort of situation looks like, right? It doesn't look that special. It's just some old people in puff jackets going through a gate, right? The next one is School of the Americas Watch, is a movement against a military training school in Fort Benning, Georgia, that trains Latin American military personnel in the United States. And this school has been linked with many of its graduates, particularly in the 1980s, were linked with some of the worst atrocities that happened in the civil wars in Central and South America in those decades. So it's this place where some really bad things have gone down. And this is traceable. And so there has been a longstanding movement against this school that was also founded by a priest. And it also has lots of Catholic symbolism. It has many more participants who are not necessarily religious, but Plowshares is quite specific, that it's really a particular form of Catholicism that is almost always involved. School of the Americas Watch is often religious, often Catholic, but not exclusively. There's one more slide. There you go. So this is an example of what an arrest looks like at Fort Benning, right? They hop over the fence and almost instantaneously are carried away. And at this particular school, almost always serve the maximum sentence for this, which is 6 months or more. So I interviewed 43 people who had completed their sentences from 1980 until 2009, were the various sentences that the people who were included had lived through. And very quickly, some interesting sort of things popped up about this group of people. First, they are almost all white. So 41 of the 43 are white. Almost all are professional, retired professionals, priests and nuns. 12 of my 43 were clergy, 5 priests, 7 nuns. And they often were people of means, or they belonged to religious communities that took care of their financial needs. So they were, clergy, or they belonged to the Catholic worker, which, if you belong to the Catholic worker, you live on air. But meeting your material needs is not necessarily a project that an individual is in charge of, right? So they were freed up from taking care of many of the sort of daily responsibilities that most people are responsible to, their mortgage, their childcare, right, their day job. These folks, often because they had chosen a life that allowed them to do this form of activism. It wasn't necessarily accidental. And then the other thing about them is that they were older. So they were 60s, 70s, 80s. And really a remarkable number of them, when I interviewed them, were in their 80s and had done their actions in their 70s and 80s. So they're an older group of privileged white folks. And so here's this interesting technique, right? So I came to this having a pretty solid background in nonviolence. And nonviolence is known as people power. That's sort of the mechanism by which nonviolence works. Nonviolence works because when regular people get together and do something that is in alignment with their conscience, with their beliefs, with something that is just, then it moves people to see the truth of that, right? So nonviolence is called satyagraha, which is truth force, or seeking for truth, right? And it's sort of exposing, the mechanism of nonviolence is exposing something that's more just, more true, more humane, that calls on our sort of deep, true human nature and makes it very difficult to unsee, right? So nonviolence is available to anyone, and in general in the world, it is a method that is used by people with less power who are confronting people with more. So it is peasants, it's striking workers, it's women, it's people of color, it's whoever doesn't have power in that situation, demanding that more of their humanity is seen and given, right, the respect it deserves. Well, prison witness, this technique of going to jail for 6 months or more, is a slightly different thing. It's a different thing that's going on for participants, particularly if, they're all white, they're all elderly, they're all people of, they are retired professors, they're priests, they're people, who have a lot of status and clout in their community, and they're not acting with a group of others. There'll be a vigil with thousands of people, but then one person crosses the line, right? Or 3 people cross the line. This is a very individualized technique. And my third participant in my book, a woman named Ray Kramer, who's from here, and some of you probably know, told me very clearly in the beginning of our interview, she said, Anya, the way that prison witness works is, the more you're connected to mainstream life, the more effective and powerful is the witness, right? So in other words, if you are a person of privilege, your impact, your action is going to have a different effect than if you were not. Now, this is certainly true when people are incarcerated, because the US, and the part of this project, again, that I didn't expect was this is also really a study of US prisons, because these are a very unusual form of prisoner. They're there because they have chosen to be there. And so a lot of the ways that the US prison works is through shaming, through dehumanization, through telling you you're bad, through telling you that the worst thing you've ever done is the hallmark by which all things are judged. And these folks are like, I've never been prouder, right? So it's like a duck on water. A duck with water, it doesn't work. And so it's sort of this unusual vantage point into the prison system as well. But some people had really horrific experiences in prison, but there was always sort of a reason that you could sort of trace it to. The two people of color in my study were both sent immediately to maximum security, solitary confinement, were harassed, interrogated. One woman was interrogated every day for 6 weeks. She went into this prison with 5 other women who had all crossed the line with her at Fort Benning, 5 white elderly women. She was a younger Asian American woman, and she was pulled out, sent to solitary and interrogated daily for 6 weeks before she was sent to the minimum security camp with the other 5 women. There's no explanation that makes sense beyond race. It's not subtle, right? There's not a subtle sort of something else could be going on. Both of them had horrific experiences. And that is the reality that we live in, that it makes sense that prison witness is not a strategy that's necessarily so accessible and available for people of color. It's not as safe. It's just that we don't live in a world where that gets to be true yet. So anyway, I digress a little bit. So privilege, power, yeah, good, great. Some of you might know, oh, here's Ray Kramer. Here's Claire Gray, who lives in Ithaca. Ed Panan is in the paper all the time if you read the, he used to write letters all the time, I don't know, imagine he still does. Local folks, right, who are doing this. So the other piece of this is that the activists who do this know that they are privileged, and they know that their privilege is making a difference. And so it's this very interesting sort of, I come to this with a women's studies background, right, transnational feminist framework of analysis that's going to be very interested in how people are using their privilege on behalf of others, right? Or as something, it's really, I mean, I think of privilege as sort of the jet fuel of prison witness in terms of what makes the mechanism work. It's different. It's different to have an 82-year-old nun go to jail because people who hear about that are like, well, but a nun, but she's a good person. And it's that cognitive dissonance, it's that critical thinking that is activated by a good person going to jail. And so it's reliant on privilege to be effective. At the same time, these are folks generally who are interested in systemic change. They want to change the systems of oppression that form the world that we live in today. So they do not want to reinforce racism through relying on whiteness as a powerful piece of what makes their action work, right? And so that negotiation of what is that thinking, how do they do this in the best way that they can, I have over time come to agree, I agree with my participants that we do not live in a world in which we have the luxury to act outside of our identities. We have to realize that our identities impact and shape what we do, what we can do, the effect that those things have, whether or not we know it or want it to be true or try not to. Who we are matters. And so justice action prisoners, who I call, you might call them prisoners of conscience. They don't like that name, so we renamed them. And then the book, they're called Justice Action Prisoners, are among the group of people who have said, I know I'm going to make mistakes. I know it's going to be messy. I know it's imperfect. But I'm going to continue relying on my privilege to do these things because something has to be done. And the alternative is doing nothing, and we know that's worse, right? If what we have is a world in which the most privileged and high-status people in the United States decide to sit this one out because I don't want to reinforce my privilege, and right, then we're really toast. So you got to do something, but it means putting your neck out, and it means maybe making a mistake, and almost certainly making a mistake, right? So there's various things that the activists do to try to use their privilege in the most responsible way that they can. And the beginning of that is just simply awareness. knowing that that's what you're doing is a massive step in the right direction. And I can talk about some of those specific things. I'll get back to that if we want to. I bet we should. Oh yeah, so they use privilege really strategically for good. Diane, can I borrow your book? My book was in my, I just saw you had it. I left it in my suitcase upstairs because I'm flying home this afternoon. But I have a quote from one of my participants that talks about using privilege strategically. So I'll read you this quote. It's a little bit long, but I think you'll like it. This is an Anglican priest from New York City. His name is Father Luis Barrios. And he's from Puerto Rico, but is now a professor at John Jay and an Anglican priest. And so I asked him in our interview, I said, do you wear the collar when you know you're going to be arrested? And this is what he said. He said, yes, I like to do that. It's a power struggle, and because it's a power struggle, I take advantage of that. So, uniform to uniform. We did Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Faith. So it was about 18 religious leaders, Muslims, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, and the police have a lot of difficulty because everyone says, let's do what we all know how to do. Let's pray. We all prayed. Every religion prayed. I remember the lieutenant came to me and he says, excuse me, Father. I say, yes? We need to do the arrest. I say, I'm praying to God. He said, I'm sorry. Let me know when you're finished. So he just stood there. He doesn't know. He said, are you finished praying to God? I said, no, not yet. I'm getting there. And he's laughing. He's laughing this whole time. Right? I'm just waiting for the media to get there. Okay, then I'll get a police officer, Italian. He'll say, my mother's going to kill me when I tell her I arrested a priest. She's going to kill me. She's not going to talk to me. I don't know why I do this. The police always say, I'm so sorry I have to do this. It's my job. I say, I know this is your job. This is my job. This is why I'm here. So you do your thing, I'll do mine. So yes, I take advantage of the collar. So you can see there's tremendous awareness, but strategy, right? It's for a purpose. It's for the movement goals. So that's the using privilege for good. Thank you for the book. Okay. The other piece of this, that this completely blew my mind, was that acting in resistance at this level turned out to be a very gendered experience. And it was gendered along a very neat binary of women having one experience and men having another experience. Partly, I'm sure this is because the activists are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? So they have lived their lives in a particular way. But there's also something sort of essential about a gendered experience of what it means to live in the world that showed up in this research in remarkably clear ways. And so basically, the men, from the moment, everyone had their similar process of deciding how to do it and thinking about it and what they call discernment, which is the process of deciding what to do and where and how. That was all, there was no gender difference. But from the moment they crossed a line, or the moment they banged on a nuclear weapon, the moment that they started to engage, basically what happened is men told me something like, and then I was part of a nonviolent legacy of resistance right? And they felt really good about being part of a strategy that was powerful and that put their conscience in alignment with what they were doing. And women said things to me like, I had never stood up to my ex-husband before. And I felt like I was finally telling him, right? It was this completely personal story. It was about motherhood. It was about former partners. It was about their alcoholic parent. It was this personal story that had nothing, almost always, to do with the particular issue, even though all of them knew all about the issues, right? These are incredibly intelligent people. You don't do this without knowing a lot about U.S. weapons policy or whatever the issue is. You've done your homework to be willing to spend 6 months in jail. So intellectually, they're all the same. But the men have an experience of being part of a legacy of nonviolence, and the women have an experience of this is what it feels like to stand up to authority, and I've never done it before, and authority is generally male, and as a woman, I did this. And it was 100% consistent, with the exception of every single nun who did not talk about themselves. They were part of a legacy that was biblical. Right? So it didn't necessarily have to do with the nonviolence. It was about this is my work, right? One nun said, I've got to live the gospel to the hilt. If not me, who? Right? So for her, that was what it was about. But this very neat gender division, and then that stayed true in the prisons. I don't think I have a slide about the prison, but you want to? Oh, I do. So the men's prison, first of all, it's not totally fair because we're talking about gendered institutions, which are very different one from another, right? So the men's prison is described to me as, right, like a high school locker room with all the bizarre, psychosexual, homophobic brutality of that space. But in that space, the men said things like this: I spent a year reading, right? It was like a monk's cell. I learned more about divinity in that 1 year than in all my years in divinity school, right? They were solitary, and you can't say that's not a form of activism. It is a form of activism to deepen your spiritual practice. But it's a particular kind of activism, and that's what the men engaged with. The women hit the ground running as part of a community. And they almost all use the word community. And I did not, my methods, important here. I asked one question: tell me about yourself and your activism. And then I asked probing questions. And if somebody really wasn't, if they weren't kind of getting somewhere, then to get it for the privilege piece without being too direct, I'd ask them about what they wore when they knew they were going to be arrested. That was my only second scripted question. So the fact that there's this sort of very neat alignment is from a very, very, very unstructured foundation, right? And so the women are extremely active when they're in prison. And they are doing things. They are protesting the vaginal search and spending the night in solitary. They are working because they felt like somebody was harassed in their class, and they are bringing attention to it, and they're spending, the week in solitary. They're writing letters home. They're writing letters to their activist movements to do things like get new mattresses, get new shower facilities, fix the toilets, right? Constantly. And they're also doing small things. Like Ray Kramer, for those of you who know her, would go around. She was the dessert lady. That was her. Everyone has a job in prison. And her job was the dessert lady. And she would serve it like a waitress. And she would just go around and she would, do you want it the centerpiece or the side piece? And that sounds like a simple question. But when you're in prison, you have to remember prison works by the erasure of individuality. So if you send a letter, right, some of these people, when I'd send them a letter to Reverend so-and-so, right, it would come back to me because he was not a reverend, he was an inmate. It works by the erasure of individuality. And so giving somebody a choice, do you want the center or the side? Treating them like a human being in that moment is small, but it's a radical act. It's reminding somebody of their humanity, right? And so the women, even in the smallest ways, they did this constantly, every day, all of them, including the nuns. And the men prayed in their cells and read lots of books. And it was just neatly divided, with the exception of Luis Barrios, this priest, who actually was quite active. He's a liberation theologist, and he did all sorts of things with the men in maximum security in New York City, where he was. Okay, so the end of the story here is that who we are matters, right? And part of this is connected to our privilege, and something like prison witness, absolutely fundamental. Who we are matters. And whether we know it or not, right? It shapes what happens to us. It shapes how we experience it. It shapes how we tell our stories about it. And privilege is tricky, but my sort of argument here is we have to use all the tools in our arsenal to fight for the things we care about right now. And so it's one of the things to know about. I can talk a lot more about it if you have questions. But to be aware of what we have. And everyone has privileges. Everyone's got their own constellation of whatever it is that sets them apart. So we've all got those, and we can all use them. And that gender is really a key shaper of experience. I joke, my advisor is Chandra Mohanty from the Women's Studies Department, and I tell her all the time, like, all that my research is really doing is saying that women's studies is right. Right? Like, yeah, yep, we've been theorizing this for a long time, and I'm like, here's another example of how that is true. But gender really does matter as an axis of experience. So hopefully I left you plenty of time for questions. Thank you for listening.
We have about 25 minutes for any questions for Anya related to this presentation or her work. going to open the floor.
Yeah, Logan.
Hi, everyone. So first of all, thank you so much. That was lovely, wonderful presentation, and your passion for it is really just admiring. And I just had a question related to something that I'm kind of comparing to in my mind. I took a undergraduate course on terrorism and unconventional forms of terrorism, and I did a study on the Earth Liberation Front, based out of Eugene, Oregon, who the movement started off as blocking logging service roads and jacking equipment. Eventually escalated into arson in multiple cases. But a lot of these, it was controversial at the time, their trial, some of them were charged with the terrorism attachment. And that, the connotations of that, there's a lot attached to that label when that's what you're tried for, and a lot of them were found guilty. And I'm just wondering if that's anything that you have dealt with in your research or work.
So the Transform Now activists were charged with terrorism.
Okay.
And there was one other Plowshares group that were charged with terrorism. In both cases, they were dismissed. Claire Grady, so it must have been like 2009 Plowshares action that was charged with terrorism. So neither of them actually faced those charges, but the 82-year-old nun was originally presented with a 32-year sentence, and it was on terrorist charges. And I mean, they are entering the inner sanctum, right? It was extraordinarily embarrassing, the Transform Now Plowshares for the Obama administration, and it created this massive sort of internal investigation, because if an 82-year-old nun can get into like what's supposed to be the most protected nuclear site, maybe they're not doing such a great job. So so that has certainly happened, and there's a broader debate within nonviolence of does the destruction of property count as nonviolence. So Plowshares are very, very careful to only destroy property, not ever human beings, although there's an argument by some that by being in a shoot-to-kill zone, you are putting yourself at risk, and as a result, you're putting whoever might shoot you at risk because you will traumatize them, right? So you could do violence to the people who harm you by putting yourself in that, right? People care a lot about making sure they're doing the right thing. So that's sort of the broader argument. The Plowshares' response is that they're destroying property that doesn't have a right to exist. And so they're, as Dan Berrigan said, it's better, when he destroyed draft cards during the Vietnam War, he said it's better to burn paper than men, right? So it's one of these, the legal defense will be what's called the necessity defense, which is basically like you have the right to break into somebody's house and save their child from the third-story window if the house is on fire, right? You're not going to charge them with trespass because it was necessary, and that is their defense, right? That basically, like, the world is on fire, we've got to act, and so this smaller offense is not important in the scheme of things, but it's an unanswerable. There are just people on both sides of the debate within nonviolence. Plowshares is very careful to destroy only property, but it's complicated. Yeah.
Hi, Anya. Thank you so much. It's awesome, and it's so exciting to see you move from dissertation to book. Congratulations.
Thanks.
So I have a few questions, but I'll just start with one. I'm wondering if you could talk about how the activists how they talk about the effect of prison witness. So what do they understand they gained by engaging in this form of nonviolent?
Yeah. Effectiveness is always tricky in any social movement, forever and ever. There's a spectrum here between what could be thought of as faithfulness and effectiveness. And so some of the religious activists will say what's important is to be faithful, and that's all that matters. And if you're faithful, then the ripple effect of that is good, right? And for them, Christ-like and biblical. And so that's all they're after. And there are others who are very strategically choosing prison witness because they think it is the most effective thing they can do in terms of changing policy. Now, these are not naive folks who think that by me crossing the line at Fort Benning, I'm going to close down a U.S. military school, right? They know that it's not, going to be such a neat cause and effect. But they take sort of an assessment of who am I? I'm an ordinary person, right? I'm a Catholic worker in Iowa. I have no power. I have no money. I have no broader sort of network. But if I cross the line at Fort Benning, it's the most powerful thing I can do. And one of my, this Catholic worker in Iowa said, he will get phone calls from reporters, and they say, shouldn't you just be outside and be doing your activist work rather than being, MIA for 6 months? Isn't it more effective for you to not go to jail? And his response is, would you be calling me if I hadn't gone to jail? Right? So effectiveness is often, and then they write no, obviously. The answer is always no. So the effectiveness is maybe around something like generating media attention, increasing consciousness, but and they are doing it because they want to close the school, but they're working towards smaller goals. Yeah, Lou?
I wonder if there's a discernible difference in the two causes that were being worked on. The school of Plowshares. The school, as I recall, had very large groups involved, and they thought they had reason to think they might make a difference.
Yeah.
And they did.
Yeah.
People argue whether changing the curriculum really changed anything, but they did. They did change the school.
They did change the school.
And the goal of ending nuclear weapons was not foreseeable by this. Did that make any difference in their feelings and responses? I don't know.
Around efficacy, you mean?
How much overlap there were.
You mean, did it make a difference in terms of how they thought about efficacy, or?
Well, about all the things that you very interestingly described about what the prison experience meant and how you dealt with it.
Right, so just the general differences between the movements.
What?
Just general differences between the movements, right? Like the participants. Well, first, there's a lot of overlap. So a lot of Plowshares activists have also protested the School of the Americas, not the other way. Plowshares is so specific. They get much longer sentences, as you might imagine, right? Their actions are much more dramatic. So yes, one is that the religious foundation of the Plowshares activist is so deep and so sort of, it's the foundational part of their life. And so one thing that really showed up was around issues around like solidarity. So School of the Americas Watch activists consider themselves to be solidarity activists, right? They're working on behalf of folks in Latin America who can't speak for themselves because the context is not safe for them to do that. So they're sort of using their privilege on behalf of, they're speaking for, they're doing it in the most responsible ways they can, but whereas Plowshares activists are like, I'm doing this on behalf of everyone. We are all, right? If we're 100 seconds to midnight, that doesn't discriminate between anything. Doesn't matter, the haves and the haves not, it does not matter. And so their analysis of privilege tended to be far less sophisticated. They didn't think about it so much, but most of that was really just because they were, it fundamentally didn't matter. And when if we are all children of God, but for them, that is absolutely right? And so it just doesn't matter. All of these other earthly differences between us are just baloney, because at the end of the day, it's a relationship between them and a higher power. And so a less sort of, it mattered less. School of the Americas folks tended to be much more sort of politicized and maybe nuanced and sophisticated around sort of issues around identity and politics and racialized politics and all these things in ways that Plowshares, it was just really about me and God. And so And it's a little tricky, the gender piece, because the nuns were so different. And most of the Plowshares activists are also nuns. So they did stand out, and I kind of accounted it to them being nuns. But the few women who were Plowshares activists and were not nuns still talked about themselves. So, yeah.
I was going to ask, you mentioned it a little bit, like how the activists sort of maybe connecting to like the prison resistance movement as well. I know Central New York has had sort of like the Attica uprising.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you've done any work around that, or that connection between, what's it called, like the activists going into the prison or connection to the prison resistance.
Yeah, I have not done that, but the story here is that many of the activists come out and they at least have a different consciousness around the prison. All of them. And these are privileged folks who have the option of living without knowing about certain things, right? When you have privilege, the corollary to privilege is often ignorance. Not because we're bad people, but because we don't have to know. And they have put themselves in the belly of the imperial beast, and so they see it. And so, there's a lot of eye-opening around other systems of discrimination that suddenly make sense and they understand in a different way. Again, this is one of these places where the gender division was very clear. In general, the men came out of prison and they said, oh my goodness, I have seen how imperialism works. I have seen the effect of these discriminatory systems, and it makes me more committed than ever to my disarmament work. And the women came out of prison and they say, oh my goodness, I've seen all of these things, and now I'm a prison abolitionist, and I am shifting my area of focus, and I'm no longer working on disarmament, or I'm only partly working on disarmament, and this huge other section of my work is now around prisons. And that stays true. And one of my few exceptions in my women to this is she came to my talk the other day, Nancy Gwynn, and she's like, Anya, I have to tell you about all the things I'm doing about prison. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're wrongly categorized in the book. Because now it's like the main thing that she does. So yeah, there's a huge sort of awakening around that. And really concrete activism. Very, it's around things like getting new mattresses. It's really, they're trying to improve people's lives in the system. Yeah, go for it.
I have another question, and you just kind of prefaced it, but I'm curious how your interviewees have reacted to the book, and I assume you've shared it with them, and so what do they make of your analysis, particularly around the gender?
I know. Well, the gender piece. So I did a talk at the Women's Info Center on Allen Street a couple of days ago, and 4 of the people who are in the book came, which was really a treat. And I felt like, and I talked a lot more that night about the privilege piece, and also talked about the gender piece. And my feeling when I was getting ready for the talk was like, oh, like they all know about the privilege piece. They told me what they're doing here. The gender piece is the piece that is going to surprise them, right? That's the finding that is going to be interesting to them. And certainly that seems to be true. I think, and I try really hard in my book to write carefully and to explain it in terms of sort of just existing power dynamics. But the men tend to feel a little embarrassed, I think, because it's such a different recounting of experience. And the women are just, what they do is so powerful. And, that difference between like really organizing women in prison and reading in a cell, and the men are kind of like, oh, we all did that, right? But I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I think there's a lot of sort of gendered reasons for it. And there's a reason that, men tell me a story that kind of position themselves as experts. And it's not because men are showing off, it's because we're socialized in a world where men feel more more empowered to share what they know as experts with, and I'm doing this research 10 years ago, like young looking blonde girl who's interested in everything that they say. And women are reaching out to me as a fellow mom. And, well, let me, you know how this feels. You remember how, you've probably had something like this happen to you. And they're connecting with me very much as an individual. And so sort of the stories that are told are larger, they reflect larger patriarchal patterns that are not, they're exactly in line with what we would expect. But when you kind of surface them so just blatantly, it's just so, and I mean, to me, I had to go back through my research so many times because I was like, really? Is it every man who does this and every woman except for the nuns who do this other thing? And it's really that, like, it's that stark. And so it was just like, yeah, here's this story, which I do think is a generational story. I mean, it would be, I keep waiting for somebody to ask me a question around this gender binary. Yeah, is that your question?
Yeah, and I don't know what you're going to do next, because I know you're quite busy with other things, but, you know, you are talking about particular movements with a particular age group of
Yeah.
people, particular race, on and on and on. And as you say, we now have other movements, we have Black Lives Matters, and we have other movements that are not the traditional older white-led movement.
Right.
And so it would just be really interesting to see what patterns you would find in those newer movements. What do you, I mean, this is,
I agree. I mean, and I would have never ever guessed this,
yeah.
right? And so I won't hazard a guess of what I would find. But I can't imagine that just the neat gender story would be possible with a younger generation. But then I also think, I mean, there are certain experiences that are just, they're just part of what it means to live in this world. That you have certain ways that you're treated, the ways that things happen, the ways you think about yourself in this world that we live in. So I actually, can I read one more little paragraph really fast? Because I've been thinking about this. Is that okay? What time is it?
Oh, yeah,
We have time. Okay. I really wanted to have time. There's a woman, poor Diane. You're going to have to listen to it again. There's a woman in my research named Kathleen Rumpf. She's also from here. Some of you might know her. And she really described for me sort of these body stories, what I called body stories, like what it means that your particular body matters. I'm just going to read you the first paragraph about her. Some of my favorite body stories came from Kathleen Rumpf, a septuagenarian member of the Catholic Worker now most active in the field of prison reform. Kathleen has been arrested over 100 times so far for violations including those against the SOA, hammering on a B-52 bomber, and participating in the killer drone protests in central New York. Liz McAllister once described Kathleen as a one-woman crime wave. She's a busy activist. Kathleen uses humor as a way to break down barriers between herself and others. She often pleads innocent on behalf of governmental insanity. At the SOA, she commits art. As a prisoner, she is part of the injustice system, and her often raunchy jokes catch those of us expecting her to act the part of an old Catholic lady delightfully off guard. She laughed when she told me about being arrested at the Griffith Air Force Base, where she asked one of the soldiers why the B-52s were called buffs. He said, "It means big, fat, ugly." And I looked at him and I said, "Don't you ever call me that." Living as an over 400-pound woman for much of her life, Kathleen has been known to threaten arresting officers with the phrase, "Be nice, or I'll go limp." And on I go. Right, so this is a gendered story, but it's also a story of a fat woman. And we have moved to a place where we are exploding the gender binary and we understand that it's a spectrum and all of the things, but have we really moved beyond a point where a fat woman is going to be treated differently? And I think that it's just a more complicated story. And so it's interesting to me to kind of I am curious how this would be in a more contemporary and younger group of activists, but I don't actually think we're beyond that, right? I don't think we've moved to a place where we understand that gender is more complicated, but these sort of stereotypical, still sort of identity categories that people fit into, I still think have a tremendous amount of power in shaping how we're treated, how we experience parts of the world. All right, I bet I'm done.
Time for one more question. Does anyone have any thoughts?
Go, Diane.
Okay. them, it was after they had done the witness and the changes in the atmosphere around had changed. Were they talking about how it could be used then? But the real question I'm getting to is, so is there a place for prison witness in this time when we're, sliding into fascism? And where does that go? And maybe that's just something for us all to think about, but any comments you have would be.
I mean, in terms of efficacy, I don't know. That's something for all of us to think about. The other side of this is that the prison industrial complex in this world is getting, in this country, is getting tighter and crueler. And so the cost of going to prison for 6 months is very different than what it was in 1982. And people who are going to prison today, and they generally are sent to minimum security camps, right? So what we think of as like, what people will, negatively talk about as like, golf club resort. Even these most sort of low security prisons in the United States are becoming quite cruel and harmful. So the last person who crossed the line at Fort Benning was in 2012, and she had celiac, so she's gluten intolerant. Something that in the outside world is like every other person we know, right? In prison, she almost died, She was naked on the floor of Carswell Correctional, which is the only women's medical facility in the United States, because she had almost died in all of the other prisons she had been to, and they were shooting her up with drugs intravenously, and she, when she got out of prison, said the only reason she was alive was because she belonged to a movement. And she had literally hundreds of letters arriving every week asking how she was doing, and she was literally like unconscious, naked on a floor for about 2.5 months. And this is for crossing a line for a minimum security, low, it's just the potentials of what can happen are too unpredictable right now for this to be a strategy that is, certainly movements aren't recommending it anymore, right? School of the Americas completely stopped they took their prisoner of conscience tab off of their website. It's like they don't even want to, I'm not part of these meetings, so I don't know what the rationales are, but they are not advertising this as something that they recommend at all. And I think it's just because it's too dangerous. So it's, it's one thing, one thing to go, historically going to prison is really important as part of sort of a nonviolent strategy. So it's one thing to go for a night or a week, but it's just, movements are not really suggesting that anyone try it in this context right now. So it's both, right? I mean, it's further evidence of what you're saying, right? This slide into fascism where the correctional system is just so cruel is part of that. That's not a very happy place to end. But I still am really glad you came. I really appreciate you, Logan, for organizing, and I'm happy to answer questions after our chit chat if anyone has something else. Thank you.
Thank you. On that note, any other follow-up questions about this session? Feel free to reach out to myself or Tara, who will probably be back in shortly, if you want access to the audio and presentation from today. Otherwise, it'll be uploaded onto the park website within the next 2 weeks. But if you would like it in advance, please feel free to contact me or anyone of us at Park. So, thank you all so much, and thank you, Anya.
Thank you, Logan.